In the summer of 2023, Martin Brady stood in her grandmother's attic, surrounded by dust and forgotten memories. She was a historian by training, specializing in early 20th-century American social movements. What she found that day would challenge everything she thought she understood about her family's past. Wrapped in yellowed newspaper and tucked inside a wooden crate was a glass plate negative. The label, written in faded ink, read simply, Finch Family 1901. Martin carefully lifted the plate to the light. Through the reversed tones of the negative, she could make out 4 figures arranged in the formal, rigid pose typical of turn-of-the-century photography. A man stood at the back, his hand resting on an ornate chair. A woman sat primly, her hands folded. 2 children flanked them. A teenage boy and a younger girl. They were well-dressed, prosperous-looking, utterly unremarkable. Martin took the plate to a specialist. She needed a high-resolution digital scan, something that could capture every detail locked in the silver emulsion. When the files arrived 3 weeks later, she opened them on her laptop. She zoomed in on the faces. And then she saw it. The eyes. All 4 members of the Finch family had eyes that were wrong. Instead of the dark pupils and clear whites she expected, each person's eyes were clouded by an opaque, milky film. It covered their irises completely, giving them the appearance of blindness. The effect was uniform across all 4 subjects. It was not a smudge on the glass. It was not a reflection from the scanning process. The anomaly was embedded in the photographic image itself. Martin stared at the screen. She had examined hundreds of photographs from this era. She had never seen anything like this. The image was deeply unsettling, but more than that, it was a mystery. What had happened to the Finch family? And why would a photographer capture them this way? She began her investigation the only way she knew how: research, documentation, facts. The first step was understanding who these people were. Martin dug through genealogical records, census data, and local histories. The man in the photograph was Casey Finch. He was born in 1862 in Massachusetts and had moved to a small mill town in New Hampshire in the late 1880s. By 1900, Casey Finch was the most powerful man in town. He owned the Riverside Textile Mill, the primary employer in the community. The mill produced cotton fabric, primarily sheeting and shirting, which was sold throughout New England. The woman was Shepherd Finch, Casey's wife. She was 34 years old in 1901, known in local society pages as a gracious hostess and patron of the local church. The teenage boy was their eldest son, Aidan Finch, aged 16. The girl was their daughter, Baker Finch, aged 9. The Finch family lived in a large colonial revival home on a hill overlooking the town. They employed a cook, a housekeeper, and a groundskeeper. By every measure, they were the picture of Edwardian prosperity. Their wealth was built on the booming textile industry, and they were respected pillars of their community. But something had gone terribly wrong. The eyes in the photograph demanded an explanation. Martin contacted Malcolm Baker, a specialist in early photographic processes. She sent him the high-resolution scans and asked for his professional assessment. Malcolm had spent 30 years studying daguerreotypes, tintypes, and glass plate negatives. If anyone could explain the anomaly, it was him. Malcolm examined the files for 2 days. Then he called Martin. "The first thing you need to understand," Malcolm said, "is how photography worked in 1901. The camera used a glass plate coated with light-sensitive silver salts. The exposure time could be anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds, depending on the available light. The subject had to remain perfectly still, or the image would blur." Martin listened carefully. She needed to understand the technical side before jumping to conclusions. "I've examined your plate very carefully," Malcolm continued. "The clouding over the eyes is not a defect in the glass itself. It's not a scratch, a stain, or water damage. The anomaly is part of the emulsion layer. It was there when the photograph was taken, or it was added during the developing process. Could it be an artifact of the exposure? Martin asked. Maybe they blinked? Malcolm paused. That was my first thought. If a subject blinks during a long exposure, you can sometimes see a ghostly doubling or a slight blur over the eyes. But this is different. The opacity is too complete, too uniform. It doesn't look like an eyelid caught mid-blink. It looks like something covering the eye itself, or something wrong with the eye. Martin felt a chill. A medical condition? That would be my next guess, Malcolm said, but I'm not a doctor. You should consult someone with medical expertise. Martin thanked him and ended the call. The technical explanation had failed. The photographer had not made a simple mistake. Something else was at play. She reached out to Evie Harmon, an ophthalmologist with a side interest in medical history. Martin sent her the scans and explained the situation. Evie agreed to take a look. When Evie called back, her voice was cautious. The clouding you're seeing is consistent with severe cataracts, she said. Cataracts cause the lens of the eye to become opaque. In advanced cases, the entire pupil can appear white or gray. It was a common condition in the past, especially in older adults. Could it affect children? Martin asked, thinking of young Baker Finch. It's rare, but yes. Congenital cataracts can occur in children, especially if there's a genetic component. However, for an entire family to present with advanced cataracts simultaneously, including 2 young people, that would be extraordinary. I'd expect to see some variation in severity. This looks too uniform. What about an infection? Martin pressed. Something that affected them all at once? Evie was silent for a moment. Certain infections can cause corneal scarring or opacity, but they typically don't affect the lens itself in this way. And again, the uniformity is strange. Infections spread at different rates. Some family members would be more affected than others. This doesn't fit that pattern. Martin thanked her and hung up. The medical explanation was incomplete. There was something else going on. She decided to pursue a darker possibility. Post-mortem photography was common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Families often posed their deceased loved ones as if they were alive, a final portrait to preserve their memory. The dead were dressed in their finest clothes, positioned in chairs, sometimes with their eyes propped open. But the eyes always gave it away. They looked wrong, sunken, milky, lifeless. Could the Finch family portrait be a memorial? Were they all dead? Martin contacted Amora Chen, a forensic archivist who specialized in vital records. She asked Amora to search for death certificates, obituaries, and burial records for the Finch family around 1901. Amora worked quickly. Within a week, she had an answer. I found a death certificate for Baker Finch, Amora said. She died on March 14, 1901. At age 9. Cause of death was listed as diphtheria. Martin felt a jolt of recognition. The photograph was dated March 16, 1901, she said. 2 days later. Exactly, Amora confirmed. It's very possible that Baker was already deceased when the portrait was taken. That would explain her eyes. Post-mortem photography was standard practice. The family might have wanted one final image of her with them. It was a breakthrough, but it was not the full answer. What about the rest of the family? Martin asked. Amora sighed. That's where it gets complicated. I found census records, tax records, and local directories. Casey Finch lived until 1932. Shepard Finch died in 1928. Aidan Finch survived until 1946. They were all alive for decades after this photograph was taken. Martin stared at the image again. One set of clouded eyes could be explained by death, but 3 others? That made no sense. The post-mortem theory was incomplete. She was running out of explanations. The technical analysis had failed. The medical analysis had failed. The post-mortem theory only explained one subject. Martin realized she was approaching the problem from the wrong angle. She had been focusing on the family, but maybe the answer was not in their biology or their mortality. Maybe the answer was in their wealth, in the mill. Martin decided to investigate the source of the Finch family fortune. She asked Amora to dig into the history of the Riverside textile mill. What Amora found changed everything. The mill had opened in 1892, during the height of the industrial boom. It employed over 300 workers, many of them immigrants from Ireland, French Canada, and Italy. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay low. But it was work, and in a town with few options, that meant survival. Amora found labor reports filed with the state in 1900. The reports painted a grim picture. The mill had been cited multiple times for unsafe conditions. The ventilation was inadequate. The machinery was dangerous. And one room in particular drew repeated complaints: the bleaching room. In the bleaching room, raw cotton fabric was treated with caustic lime and sulfur dioxide to achieve the bright white finish demanded by buyers. The chemicals were harsh. The fumes were toxic. The workers, many of them children as young as 10, spent 12-hour shifts in that room with minimal protection. Amora found newspaper articles from the local Gazette. In 1900, a reporter had written a scathing piece about conditions at the mill. "The air in the bleaching room is thick with fumes," the article read. "Workers complain of burning eyes, difficulty breathing, and chronic coughing. Management has refused to install proper ventilation, citing cost concerns." Martin read the article with growing anger. But there was more. Amora found the ledger of the town's physician, Dr. Rory Sutton. The ledger covered the years 1899 to 1902. It was a meticulous record of every patient Dr. Sutton treated, along with their symptoms and diagnoses. The entries were horrifying. Starting in late 1899, there was a sudden spike in cases of corneal ulceration, chemical keratitis, and occupational blindness. The patients were almost all mill workers. Many of them were children. March 5, 1899. Marley O'Neill, age 12. Mill worker, severe burning of the eyes, corneal opacity in both eyes, vision severely impaired. June 14, 1899. Sidney Kowalski, age 14. Mill worker, chemical burn to cornea, partial blindness in left eye. October 2, 1900. Alana Murphy, age 11. Mill worker, chronic exposure to lime dust, bilateral corneal scarring, permanent vision loss. The ledger went on and on. Dozens of cases. Dozens of workers, mostly children, blinded or partially blinded by the toxic conditions in Casey Finch's mill. Martin felt sick. The clouded eyes in the photograph suddenly took on a new, terrible meaning. The Finch family was not suffering from a medical condition. They were not all dead. The eyes in the portrait were a symbol, a message. But who had sent that message? And how? Martin returned to Malcolm Baker, the photography expert. She explained what she had discovered about the mill. She asked Malcolm a new question. Could someone have altered the photograph deliberately? Could they have added the clouding to the eyes after the fact? Malcolm was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "It's called retouching. It was a common practice in that era. Photographers would use fine brushes and opaque paints to correct flaws in the negative. They could remove blemishes, soften wrinkles, even change the background. A skilled retoucher could absolutely add a milky film to someone's eyes." "Why would a photographer do that?" Martin asked. "That," Malcolm said, "is the real question." Martin went back to the archives. She needed to know who had taken the photograph. The original label on the glass plate gave her a clue. In the bottom corner, printed in neat letters, was a studio stamp. Leah Novak, photographer, Main Street. Leah Novak. The name meant nothing to Martin at first, but Amora found her in the local records. Leah Novak had operated a portrait studio in town from 1897 to 1906. She was one of the few female photographers in New Hampshire at the time. She was known for her technical skill and her eye for composition. But there was something else. Amora found an entry in Dr. Sutton's ledger. April 22, 1900. Luciana Novak, age 13. Mill worker, severe chemical burn to the right eye, corneal ulcer, vision lost in right eye. Patient is sister of Leah Novak, photographer. Martin stared at the entry. Luciana Novak, Leah's younger sister. She had been 13 years old when she lost her sight. She had been working in Casey Finch's mill. The pieces fell into place. Leah Novak had a motive. Her sister had been blinded by the conditions in the Finch mill. But Leah could not speak out directly. Casey Finch was the most powerful man in town. He controlled the economy. He controlled jobs. To publicly accuse him would mean ruin, possibly worse. But Leah Novak was a photographer. She had skills Casey Finch did not understand. She had tools he could not see. And when the Finch family came to her studio in March of 1901, grieving the death of their daughter, Leah saw an opportunity. She took the portrait. She posed the family carefully. She exposed the glass plate, and then, in the privacy of her darkroom, she retouched the negative. With a fine brush and opaque paint, she carefully added a milky film over the eyes of Casey Finch, Shepherd Finch, and Aidan Finch. She had already captured Baker Finch's clouded eyes naturally, as the girl was already deceased. It was a subtle act of defiance, a quiet protest. The Finch family, blind to the suffering they caused, would be forever immortalized with the very affliction they had inflicted on others. The workers who had lost their sight in the bleaching room would have a memorial, hidden in plain sight. When Martin shared her findings with Malcolm, he agreed. The retouching would have been invisible to the naked eye, Malcolm said. In 1901, people viewed photographs as small paper prints, not high-resolution scans. The family might never have noticed the clouding, and even if they did, they might have dismissed it as a flaw in the printing process. Leah Novak took a risk, but it was a calculated one. Martin contacted Camilla Ross, a cultural historian who specialized in labor movements and visual protest. Camilla was fascinated by the story. Photographs were powerful tools in the early 20th century, Camilla said. Reformers like Lewis Hine used them to expose child labor and unsafe working conditions. But those were overt, intentional documentaries. What Leah Novak did was different. She weaponized a family portrait. She turned a symbol of wealth and respectability into an indictment. "Do you think anyone at the time understood what she had done?" Martin asked. Camilla considered this. Probably not. But that might have been the point. Leah Novak wasn't trying to start a public scandal. She was creating a record, a hidden testimony. She knew that one day someone might look closely enough to see the truth. And in 2023, someone finally had? Martin Brady sat in her office looking at the portrait one more time. The Finch family stared back at her, their eyes clouded and blank. She thought about Luciana Novak, a 13-year-old girl who had lost her vision in a bleaching room. She thought about Marley O'Neill, Sidney Kowalski, and Alana Murphy. She thought about all the workers whose names were recorded in Dr. Sutton's ledger, their suffering documented in clinical, detached language. The 1801 portrait was no longer just a family photograph. It was a memorial. It was a protest. It was a piece of silent testimony that had survived over a century, waiting to be understood. Leah Novak could not speak openly about the injustice she witnessed, but she found a way to speak nonetheless. She used her art, her skill, and her courage to create something that would outlast the power of Casey Finch and the silence that protected him. The mystery was solved. But the story it revealed was larger than Martin had imagined. It was a story about power and exploitation, about art and resistance, about the workers who built America's industrial wealth and the price they paid. Martin decided to write a full account of her findings. She would publish it in a journal of labor history. She would make sure the names in Dr. Sutton's ledger were remembered: Luciana Novak, Marley O'Neill, Sidney Kowalski, Alana Murphy, and all the others who had suffered in the Riverside textile mill. The portrait would no longer be a forgotten relic in an attic. It would be a historical document, a reminder of a time when children worked in toxic rooms, when corporations valued profit over human life, and when one photographer found a way to fight back. Martin Brady had solved the mystery of the clouded eyes, but in doing so, she had uncovered something far more important: a story of injustice, a story of resistance, and a story that, even after more than a century, still demanded to be told.